Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming in person and online. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. Today we're going to hear from Professor Christina Hoicka. She is a Canada Research Chair in Urban Planning for Climate Change at the University of Victoria. We are very fortunate to have her here as a visiting professor at McGill to bring to the forefront of our minds the importance of justice and society in our engineering decisions. Today she will be talking to us about exactly that in the context of place. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I hope that everybody online can hear me, so let us know if you can't. First, I just want to do a quick poll of the room. How many engineers in the room? Throw up your hands. Okay, awesome. How many humanities? Awesome. And how many social scientists? Great. Thanks, everyone. That's really helpful to know. So what I'm hoping to do with this talk is to really talk about place-based understanding justice and energy transitions from place-based perspective, and to try to frame it so that engineers can follow along a little bit better. So I'm going to start by talking about technoeconomic approaches to understanding energy transitions. So those of you in engineering, you'll understand a lot about technoeconomic modeling and putting together different types of scenarios. So for example, an integrated assessment model or a technoeconomic model, you'll throw in some policies like carbon pricing, other types of regulations, and it will tell you what kind of technology and how we would abate carbon by X date. So on this screen what we have, this is from the Trottier Energy Institute, and they've modeled different scenarios for net zero and net zero plus for 2030, 2040, 2050. And I picked this one because it talks about how much of each type of fuel we expect to use. So in this one, what we can see, for example, is that petroleum products and natural gas, which are these kind of gray and brown color, they shrink quite a bit if we put in place policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if we don't, we can see right here that they don't reduce very much at all. This is what they came up with for electrification. So what we can see here for electrification is that our electricity system is this size in 2021. And if we decarbonize the electricity system by 2050 and 2060, it looks here like it will double approximately in size. And so you can see the relative shares of the different types of electricity sources like wind, solar, nuclear, hydroelectric, based on this chart. So it gives you kind of an overview of what we could get at, but not a whole lot of detail. The Canadian Climate Institute put out a report where they said, they looked at a whole bunch of different scenarios, and they said if we were to decarbonize, the electricity system would grow by 2 to 4 times the size. And the current size of the Canadian grid is at 152 gigawatts. So it's quite large, and they're predicting at least a doubling based on all of the scenarios by 2050. On the right, I've given a chart by the David Suzuki Foundation where they said, okay, let's not have any nuclear, let's only have new renewables and no fossil fuels. How big would the size of the electricity system be? And you can see that wind would be the bulk of the renewable energy added to that system, and the system size would grow tremendously. So I want to take that really big change of doubling to quadrupling the size of our electricity system if we were to decarbonize. And think about that in terms of a place-based approach. So what do I mean by that? So this is a really quick synopsis of human geography concepts. We have location, which is an absolute characteristic. It's also a relevant characteristic, like the relational proximity of one thing to another. We have landscape, which is about the assemblage of natural and cultural features across a broad space and the history of their production and interaction. We also have territoriality, and that's how social and political power are organized and exercised over space. And this becomes important in energy transitions, and we're going to see that. Place is a meaningful location. Place is about the material setting for social relations, so the actual shape of place within which people conduct their lives. They have some relationship to people and people's capacity to produce and consume meaning. So we have place attachment. And then spatiality is about the locational patterns of economic and social activities. And spatiality is thinking about those variations in social and economic structures and activities across space. Like, why is the economy in one place different than in another place? And that's spatiality. So I'm going to start with location. This is renewable electricity potential across Canada, and I've got biomass, geothermal, hydroelectricity, solar, and wind in these maps. And what you can see is that Canada has a huge amount of potential for renewable electricity production. But a lot of it's very, very far from where we would use it. So in the purple and the red is where we have most of the people, most of the industry, it's that spatiality of social and economic relations. So in their modeling of how we would electrify everything, the David Suzuki Foundation looked at, well, where would we put transmission line interconnections when we are growing the system by a huge amount? And so they came up with this as an estimate of what the new transmission lines could look like and where they are. And they're really, really big. This is very large infrastructure that we're talking about. So territoriality, this is how social and political power are organized and exercised over space. So all of these projects are dependent on state actors and support. We can't implement any of these really without having policies and institutions in place for them to happen. And they have to be the right policies and institutions to get the right outcomes that we want to have. So it's a really important factor in the way that renewable energy emerges and succeeds in an institutional setting. And I want to talk about two different examples here of the territoriality of electricity transitions. In the top right corner, it's a little hard to see. It would be hard to see if it was bigger, but that's downtown Toronto. And what happened in 2014 was the city of Toronto had a lot of condominiums going up, really tall condominium towers. And all of those condominium towers were using electricity. And so there was a lot of population growth there. And those really thick lines that you see, those are the transmission lines for electricity into Toronto. And the city of Toronto said, wait a second, we're not going to have enough electricity necessarily to support all of the condo development that's happening in Toronto. And there was a big sort of debate and discussion because it was Toronto Hydro, which was regulated by a provincial regulatory authority, that was making those decisions. And Toronto Hydro does a distribution line, but the transmission system is Hydro One. And so there's all of these different players who are dealing with different parts of the territory, of the landscape, that are making decisions about this. And so in the case of Toronto, there was the potential for supply shortages in the downtown core because of really rapid growth of demand. On the bottom right, that's from a recent report. And a few years ago, BC Hydro, which is a monopoly, they estimated how much power they needed to go forward into the future. The problem was a lot of different advocates pointed out that it didn't match the decarbonization strategy put out by the province. So they were two different bodies, and BC Hydro was regulated by a regulatory body, the British Columbia Utilities Commission. And their scenario, or their forecast, fell way short, which is what that gap is there, of what it was projected would be needed in order to meet the province's decarbonizing plan. And so again, a lot of political debate ensued because there was this mismatch. There's also the issue of territoriality and settler colonialism. And so when we're talking about renewable energy projects and energy infrastructure, settler colonialism structures the broader set of relations in which renewable energy projects are situated. And this is through a really broad framework of regulations, laws that are in place. And as one of my former students reminds me, ultimately the Crown retains control through veto rights on a lot of decisions. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission laid out 94 calls to action, and they endorsed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that declaration says that they have the right to control and development of the lands, territories to which they belong, including those that are confiscated. And they also have the right to free, prior, and informed consent to any future activities that take place on the land. So this is another form of territoriality that plays out in this energy transition that we're talking about. Okay, so here's a time for a quiz because I was preparing for engineers and maybe non-geographers. So place is a meaningful location. Can anyone tell me the 4 places here from the pictures? The top right's a little hard to see.
Toronto, Paris, Montreal.
Yep. And that one a little far away, it's New York. Yeah, so how can you tell? Landmarks, right? It's a meaningful place that we have attachment to those places, and we know them through the landmarks. Okay, my next quiz on place. Where is this food from? Can anyone tell me? You can go by country. Pardon? Yep, Italy, that's Naples.
Oh, we're supposed to say where it was from originally?
I took these photos in the places.
Okay.
That is from, it could be, but I took that in Berlin. The sausage. Yeah. Close. That's Colombia on the top right. That was breakfast in Colombia. And then anyone know the top left? Okay, it's called an acarajé. It's so good. It's from northern Brazil. I dream of it. It's amazing. So again, these are foods that you can really only get in those places if you want the original actual food. And so when I'm talking about place, I'm talking about the attachment that we have, the meaning to it, all of these other sets of cultural and economic values and the things that are happening and playing out in order for us to get, for example, those kinds of foods on our plates. So if we take the idea of place and meaning to energy transitions, what or who is an energy transition for is a question that I think we should be asking. So this is retired Chief Patrick Michel of Kanaka Bar Indian Band. And he's been working since the year I was born on renewable energy projects. And so he says Kanaka Bar is continually working to understand climate risks, our vulnerabilities, and implementing community transition for the environment and economies of tomorrow. And since 1989, I was born before that, we have been working towards energy security with hydroelectricity, 15 solar projects, 2 wind towers, and scaling up battery storage. So if you'd like to learn more about what they're doing, I've provided the website there. So renewable energy and an energy transition has become really important to Kanaka Bar Indian Band and to what their plans are for resilience and for transition and for community empowerment. Another project, it hasn't been built yet, but this is called Wate Power, and 24 First Nations own 51% of a hydro power line, transmission line that will be 1,800 kilometers, and it's going to connect 17 communities that are currently off-grid to the power grid. And 49% of this power line is owned by private interests. So it's a collective of Indigenous nations that own the majority of this line that is set to be built. And so you can also look up their story on their website and learn more about them and how they did that. Renewable energy projects can, and I want to emphasize the word can, provide place-based benefits. And so there's a huge list here, but some really big ones that come to my attention quite often as a researcher are electricity supply resilience, socioeconomic regeneration, employment, and infrastructure, such as new roads to places that may not have adequate roads or any roads at all. And what's really important about electricity is that it can be a means for revenue from generating electricity itself and selling it. But electricity is also a precondition for a lot of economic development and social activities that we see. There are implications that are growing right now of neglecting place-based approaches and policy design. So these are from the New York Times and from the Globe and Mail. So the New York Times had a really large report that said Britain's economy is not working. And one of the key reasons is the electricity sector. There's a lot of social opposition to new projects going online in the electricity sector. And then what's happening is because they can't grow enough electricity supply, there are startups that need electricity in order to start their companies and their businesses in other locations. And they're unable to connect to the grid because there's not enough supply to supply them. So this social opposition, it's limiting economic growth in a lot of places, and it's limiting the transition. And it doesn't have anything to do with people being, terrible or close-minded. I'm going to talk about that. In Ontario, Doug Ford, when he came into power, he canceled close to 800 community renewable energy projects. And now what's happening is they are having rolling blackouts and brownouts across the province. And communities, there's a lot of conflict within communities, between different actors in order to, that's preventing some of these projects from being built. So in order to have an energy transition, we really need to be thinking about place-based approaches and justice and how people get involved and the benefits that they get, because this is an important bottleneck in terms of moving forward. So place-based preconditions and benefits are associated with social acceptance of renewable energy projects. And this is being shown by meta-studies and meta-analysis, and it's also being shown recently in Canada through different studies. So this is a very simple chart, and on the horizontal axis we have, or on the vertical axis, we have the preconditions, or the process dimension. So how has a project been developed? You want to have a big set of solar panels somewhere. Who have you engaged in developing that project? How were they engaged? Was the process transparent? Do they feel like they were really involved and meaningfully listened to? And did they have opportunities to participate? Then there's the outcome dimension, which is who owns that project, who's benefiting from that project, where are the benefits of that project flowing to, in terms of what I talked about: jobs, pride of development, social cohesion, energy literacy, all of those things. And so if the benefits are more local and collective, so place-based, and if the process or the preconditions are open and participatory, projects are more likely to have social acceptance and to get built. Historically, though, energy development has been exclusionary and uneven. And what we find is that even if we do study it, which we don't often study the impact of these projects, what we do find is that we don't do a particularly good job of including communities and distributing benefits, which may be why there is social opposition, because there's not necessarily enough models to show that it's widespread benefiting people, or enough data to show that. Historically, the centralization of the energy sector has excluded many groups from the developmental processes of energy. And this has also turned into an uneven distribution of the project outcomes. And this has even happened with renewable energy. So the field of energy justice, which looks at distributional justice, procedural justice, and recognitional justice, is interested in understanding how we can reverse those negative impacts, how they've been experienced, and then how we can counter them. So distributional justice is effectively how are the benefits being distributed fairly? And procedural justice is about whether the process to develop a project is fair. Are people involved? And recognitional justice is about who is involved in the process to develop a project, who is being ignored and excluded, and how should they be recognized. So I want to give one small example of a justice-oriented and place-based approach to renewable energy. And this is Indigenous economic development corporations. And one of my former students, Katerina Savic, she was working for the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. And what we did was we looked at the role of Indigenous economic development corporations in renewable energy. And what we found is that these are uniquely Indigenous business models. And they've come out of that territorialization, out of this colonized context as a model that works for many Indigenous nations across Canada. And what we've found is that when an Indigenous economic development corporation is involved in a renewable energy project, there tends to be a higher level of ownership and benefits going to the community. So I'm going to talk about the application of place-based approaches in my lab, the Reimagining Social Energy Transitions Co-Laboratory. So the first project I'll talk about is the development of a handbook. The second project is about how we want to look at how renewable energy is emerging as place-based and who is involved. And the third one is about Indigenous advocacy for electricity institutional transformation. So the first thing I want to add into all of this that I didn't bring up earlier is that what's happening with this transition technologically is that we're going from a very centralized linear system on the left-hand side, where we would go from generation to transmission to distribution to the end user. And that's the electricity system that we have built up to today. But on the right-hand side, we have what we anticipate the electricity grid will look like as we decarbonize and transition. So we'll have supergrids that will carry renewable electricity really long distances, because what we saw was that a lot of the potential for renewable electricity is pretty far from centers of demand. We also do have and will have more digitally enabled electricity infrastructure. So we'll have smart grids and we'll have AI managing a lot of the flow of electricity. And then we'll also have these more localized microgrids where we'll have localized generation, we'll have storage, we'll have electric vehicles, and we'll also have prosumers, which I'll show in the next slide, I think. So how will this play out, given that where the demand is and where the supply is? And so in my lab, we've been working out the spatiality of energy transitions. So how will the demand centers and the supply centers interact, and what could these new economies look like? So that circle is my version of a city. And cities are where we have 2% of the land mass globally, but they have about 60% of greenhouse gas emissions and population. And cities are where population is going to, and cities are growing. So what I'm showing here is that we're going to have growth of cities with new people in them. And we're also going to decarbonize by having heat pumps and electric vehicles going into cities. And so that will help us reduce fossil fuel use in a lot of different ways. But what it's also going to do is increase the amount of electricity being used inside that very small area. And we started asking, my students would ask me, like, how are cities going to transition spatially? And I couldn't figure it out, and so we wrote a paper about it. And what we found was that very few papers actually modeled it. So they often model within the city, but they don't really model if a city says we're going to transition to 100% renewable energy. The models weren't really saying where the renewable energy would come from. So we did a study and we found that most cities were planning to rely on regions. So the idea being that a lot of renewable energy will pop up in regions, which is what we saw on the map where a lot of the potential for renewable energy lies. And that will be electricity generated going into cities, and that will develop new economies going into regions. But a really big question about this is, how just will this be? Do regions really want to do this? And how do we make this supportive of all communities involved? And how will this play out? So project one is about the development of a handbook. I'm working on a really large NFRF, New Frontiers in Research Fund Transformation grant that's being led through the University of Toronto. And this grant has, I think, about 100 researchers on it. It's a $24 million grant. It's very, very big. And at the center of this grant is the development of carbon reuse technology that could be developed into electricity storage or energy storage for seasonal. So it would be a great fit into an electricity grid, and it could support renewable energy. For example, we have less solar energy in the winter than we do in the summer. And this project is pretty special because we're working with two different types of communities. So one is researchers are developing relationships with communities in Yukon, which has an isolated electrical grid. And these are really, really small communities. They're all very, very different. I'll be going to Whitehorse in a few weeks to meet with some of the project leaders and community leaders and learn more about that. On the other hand, another part of the the project is in Hamilton, Ontario. And Hamilton, Ontario is and was a very large industrial base, a lot of workers, a lot of diversity in the city, a lot of socioeconomic diversity, and it also has a university. And so very, very different places, and also many different types of communities and senses of place within each place. And so one of the first projects that my lab took on was the idea that if we take a place-based approach to this project, every community has a unique set of capabilities and needs. And if we start at that point and think about how these communities are going to engage in an energy transition, Nick Jekyll in my lab has been developing a handbook about how communities can engage in new energy technologies and not necessarily have ownership. So ownership often is the goal for communities, but it also involves a lot of financial risk, and we're not there yet in terms of having enough tools and supports for communities, all communities, to feel comfortable with that level of financial risk that they could take on. So what Nick's doing is looking at the range of models for community governance of renewable energy projects. And he's identified about 50 governance arrangements. So these could be things like advisory committees. There's also a really wide range of different types of ownership. And in some cases, different types of ownership allow for different levels of risk, for example, to a community putting an investment in. So this, Nick is now trying to work with a lot of different types of actors in the system. So for example, policy actors, community actors, researchers, in order to figure out what is the most important information that should go into this type of handbook in order to help communities make decisions, but also in order for these models to scale, we need policy support too, because there needs to be institutional support for them to succeed. Our second project is how is renewable energy emerging as place-based and who is involved? And the goal of this project is to inform with the possibility for co-design of analysis. So for those of you who are engineers, I've been reading a lot about, how would we transition with renewable energy when it's variable and it's not reliable. And most of the engineering modeling that I've seen, and we ran a study on this, is that you'll have a wide range of different technologies and end uses on a grid, and you'll have prosumers, which is consumers of energy who also produce energy. You'll have a mix of different types of power that can complement each other, and you'll have bidirectionality and storage. And by bringing all of these different mixes together in what we call a renewable energy cluster, you'll have more balance on the system to integrate more renewable energy. And what we found in a study, though, was that these are really well developed in thousands and thousands and thousands of studies by engineers who have modeled this. But whether or not it's actually playing out on the ground is really hard to tell. We don't really know. But these are, on the right-hand side, considered place-based because it would really depend on the place, on the types of energy users, on the level of adoption of different types of storage or vehicles, and the types of resource potential and which ones were actually built. So there's so many different variables that would impact whether or not this could actually happen. And a really big piece of that is that it would be probably quite different in a rural area than in an urban area, for example, because urban areas are very space constrained, They don't have as much space for things like wind turbines and that kind of a thing, unless there's new technology which could be coming out. So what we were trying to get at with this was, how would this play out in different places? And what are the different types of combinations and possibilities that are emerging? Or are they even emerging at all? Because a lot of these engineering models are very hypothetical, and they're mostly doing optimization or technoeconomic analyses. But they're not often bringing in the people and the place. So what we've been doing is we've been sampling for what we call a cluster. We're looking for these clusters that I showed before, where there's a range of different users and technologies and types of actors that are involved in this. And we've been gathering these by searching academic literature, by searching the COP meetings, which has, we think, almost all NGOs involved. And we've been identifying clusters. And so to date, we've got over 600 of these clusters identified. And this is where we've identified the clusters. So most of them are in Europe, but we've also found them in Asia, in pretty much every continent that you can think of. And right now we're trying to assess whether or not it's representative. And of course, we really have no idea because nobody's looked at these clusters before. But what we have on the left-hand side is a share of our cluster distribution. And we're comparing it to GDP distribution by continent, annual electricity consumption, and electricity generation. And ballpark, we're in the ballpark, at least, in terms of ranking, even if we're not matched 1-1. So we're thinking it's pretty good. But what would this allow us to think about and answer? And these authors, O'Neill et al., they came up with a framework for thinking about pathways for renewable energy landscapes at scale. So they said, how would we think about renewable energy emerging and replicating in a place-based way in different locations? And what they argued is that we need to be thinking about multifunctionality, which is what we had in the cluster. We need to think about natural capital. We need to think about generating local value, which is that who gets the benefits, who's part of the process. Energy justice as well. We need to think about resilience to climate disruption and also decentralization. And so once we have this data set gathered, we can start to ask questions from it in terms of which projects have actually emerged. So we can ask, where are these clusters emerging? What are their characteristics? Who is involved in their governance and operation? And why are they operating? What were the factors that brought these clusters together to actually be occurring? And we think that if we can start to understand why they're operating and how they're coming about, we might get a better idea about how to replicate some of the positive aspects of these and how we could then use those lessons to accelerate renewable energy adoption, which is what we saw in those technoeconomic analyses at the beginning of the talk. Okay, this is the last project I'll talk about. So this project it's a paper we've just submitted called Stretch and Transform for Energy Justice, Indigenous Advocacy for Electricity Institutional Transformation in British Columbia, Canada. And this project is a knowledge co-creation project. In this case, because it's place-based, we partnered with an organization called Clean Energy BC and another one called New Relationship Trust. Clean Energy BC works on, tries to support the renewable energy industry, and as such, they've partnered with First Nations and developed a First Nation clean energy working group that does a lot of policy driving. The New Relationship Trust is an organization that was set up by the federal and provincial governments, and they provide funding to all 203 First Nations across BC for various programs, including clean energy programs. And on the right-hand side are the researchers who participated in the project and had this project work. So I've already talked a bit about settler colonialism and the impacts that that has had on the rights of Indigenous people, and this idea of territoriality, where we've got Indigenous nations and then we have a federal colonial government, and how this creates a lot of conflicts and a lot of gaps around Indigenous participation in the renewable energy sector. So in BC, the electricity sector is run by BC Hydro. They have over 80,000 kilometers of power lines, 300 substations, 12,000 megawatts of installed hydroelectricity across 32 facilities. They power about 95% of the province. But because of the British Columbia Utilities Commission and the regulations that they have, there's a little loophole clause where municipalities can have an exemption from the monopoly of BC Hydro. And 5 municipalities are exempted from that monopoly, and they own and operate their own electricity utilities. And actually, I think there's municipally owned and operated electricity utilities across every province except for Manitoba. So this is a really common exemption. Meanwhile, in BC, there's 203 First Nations. They are all distinct nations, all with their distinct forms of governance and histories and cultures and languages. And many of them were participating in a renewable energy procurement program that was paused in 2019. And at that time, they had 78 operational projects with First Nation involvement. 42 were selling electricity to BC Hydro, and 48 projects were under development. So the province paused this program in 2019. And so the working group through Clean Energy BC that we worked with, they started arguing this electricity shortage. They said, look, you have to start this program up again, and we think that you should give a lot of that procurement to First Nations as a form of economic development, because you won't have enough supply and you're going to have an electricity shortage by 2030. So we were asked to come in and take a look at, do a research project about the preconditions and socioeconomic benefits of renewable energy to First Nations in BC in order to support their advocacy. So we interviewed 16 nations that covered 43 planned and active projects, and these were fairly in-depth interviews that lasted minimum 1 hour. One went up to 4 hours, on average a little over an hour. And then we also did document analysis of conference presentations, community reports, and advocacy reports. And on the right-hand side is a map of the nations that chose to waive anonymity and be named in the research project. This is very messy. We're in the middle of sorting this out. But what I want to show here is across the top we have the range of benefits, and then across vertically we have the communities. And what we see is that there's a lot of benefits that the communities see from developing renewable energy projects and the benefits that they can gain. Many of the communities really value these projects and want to continue developing them and gain more benefits from them. So while we were involved in this research, there were a lot of events called a First Nation Energy Summit that were being put on. And there was a lot of organizing around this exemption. And the reason was because in 2016, there was a First Nation that applied to the BC Utilities Commission. And they said, we think we should be exempt from BC Hydro in order to run our own utility by the First Nation. And in the same way that municipalities are. And the BC Utilities Commission came back and said, you're not exempt, but we do regulate you. And because there was this gap in terms of, again, this settler colonial territoriality, the BC Utilities Commission actually wrote an inquiry report about the ability of First Nations to have their own utilities and have the same right to an exemption that municipalities have. And they said under UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that First Nations should be exempt, and they gave 35 different suggestions to implement in order to get there. And if you're interested in that topic, the report is very, very in-depth. It's a very good study. So there were a huge number of discussions about this within these energy summits that my research team got to attend, and we really learned about their argument. So they were arguing to have a First Nations power authority based on a rights-based approach. And so rather than arguing to have access to capital, which is one of the most basic arguments to get projects set up, they were saying, we want to have control over aspects of the grid. So what do I mean by that? And this is getting really theoretical, but intermediaries are organizations that are there to help scale up and support innovations, including governance innovations, and make change in order to allow those innovations to take hold into a market. And so a fit and conform strategy would be to adapt to the existing governance practices, market structures, and supply chains. So that would be saying, we can become large developers of renewable electricity. We just need to access to capital and to work within the current regime. But a stretch and transform strategy is about influencing changes to the institutional structure and energy value chains. I'm almost towards the end. What they came up with were 6 different models of power authorities, and one of them was a fit and conform approach, which was about capacity building. But the rest of these models were about taking control and ownership over aspects of the grid, and we're talking about a very large regional grid. Think about the size of the amount of electricity that needs to be added to the grid in order to decarbonize. And they were talking about having wheeling agreements, becoming retailers, and even having their own vertically integrated power authority. So underlying these proposed models was the perspective that as long as control over the energy system sits fully in the hands of colonial institutions, the opportunity provided by renewable energy cannot be fully realized. And so they were arguing that if there was the application of UNDRIP, they could seek policy pathways towards structural reforms that could incorporate their place-based relational values and regional approaches and share control with the agencies and organizations controlling the electricity system. So just to summarize on my last slide, on the right-hand side, I've got our technoeconomic chart. And on the left-hand side, I've got a summary of what a place-based approach is, which is taking into account the meaning and the landscape features of a particular place. And I want us to think more about how can we balance these 2 approaches in order to have better outcomes in an energy transition and in decision making. Thank you.